Put it on my. Okay. So hello, good
Hi there.
afternoon. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
No, my pleasure.
My pleasure too. Yes. Will you please let us know a little bit about what you teach right now and what is the relationship between COVID vaccine and what you do,
Well, let me go back to the
about the
beginning.
ethics
I'll leave
in
my glasses on.
biotechnology.
Let's see what's going on. I have a PhD and I'm a pharmacologist by training, and I got my degrees at UCLA in Los Angeles. I'm actually from California. I was born there, and I moved from California to New Orleans and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Tulane University Medical School. And in the science business, if you will, uh, one of the things you have to prove is that you can become an independent investigator. So just getting your PhD doesn't do very much to convince somebody that you know how to work independently, because you work under the supervision of your professor, whether the lab is in France or anywhere else in the world. So we do fellowships in the United States, and sometimes people go overseas for them. I decided to stay in the United States, and I did a 2-year fellowship at Tulane Medical School, and then stayed on the faculty for a year, and then moved to the pharmaceutical industry. And that was a big move in the late 70s, because when I did it, I didn't actually know anybody who had actually been in the pharmaceutical industry, and it was a very nascent industry in California. Genentech and Amgen were just a glimmer in Paul Boyer's eye, especially Genentech. So my wife had gotten the job. She's at the time was a biochemist by training. She got a job at the medical school at Jefferson, working in a laboratory. And I asked her boss to get me an adjunct appointment as an assistant professor of pharmacology at the medical school. So I figured that was sort of my fallback. If I didn't like working in industry at the bench, I could always go back to the university. And I held two jobs, but I worked for Merck at the time. And Merck's policy was you could do these things, but you couldn't be paid for it. So it was purely voluntary. So I did. I volunteered. I got promoted from assistant professor to associate professor. A couple years later, I taught in medical school, and then I started teaching in the graduate school it was Thomas Jefferson University, which was what we would call an academic medical center. At the time, we only had a medical school, graduate school, and a nursing school, and what we called a College of Allied Health Professions, where technicians were trained to work in either hematology labs or bacteriology labs. So I stayed at the bench for about 7 years, discovering drugs for human health and some for animal health. And then I was asked to start up a department of computer resources to help scientists learn how to automate their assays and move things along more expeditiously, because it was becoming very slow as a way of discovering drugs when you're looking at 20 or 30,000 compounds being made for you, and how do you screen them. So I did that for 3 years, and then I was offered a position at another campus for Merck. And what I was offered was what we would call a development position as manager of strategic planning. And I think not everybody likes strategic planning, and that's a global attitude. But because people don't quite understand what it is, people think strategic planning is spreadsheets, budgets, all of that. That's not what strategic planning is. Strategic planning is, where do you want to be? Tactical planning is producing the spreadsheets with hiring plans and how much money are we going to spend, and 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3, 3 to 5 years. So I did that for 3 years because I wanted some exposure to a multi-divisional company. And Merck, we had 40,000 people worldwide, and it let me work with corporate, but it also let me work with what we then called the Merck Sharp and Dohme International Division, and our medical directors all over the world, to understand, how do you advance the development and the discovery of medicines in different marketplaces, and also realizing that you don't register drugs everywhere. And my classic example in my class is, nobody's ever going to register a malaria vaccine in Iceland. It just isn't necessary. So I learned a lot about the business of the pharmaceutical industry, because at that time also our president was very interested in acquiring another company. And we had two merger and acquisition efforts going on at the same time. One was acquisition of another global sized company like Squibb or Bristol Myers or Abbott Labs, or then SKF, Smith Kline French. We were also looking at specifically the German market. We were not doing well in Germany. And we looked at the Beringers, Beringer Ingelheim, Beringer Mannheim. We also actually looked at Merck. And I don't think most people, especially overseas, realize that the United States Merck is not the same thing as the Merck in Germany.
Sure.
Uh, that company was in the United States, and then at World War I, all foreign companies like that were forced out of the country, like Bayer also. Their patents were confiscated, and they were forced out of the United States and they couldn't do business here. So Merck, which was eMerck, became Merck Sharp and Dome in the United States, based in Rahway, New Jersey. And so right now, Merck only has the rights to the Merck name in the United States and Canada. Everywhere else, it's MSD. And that leads actually to a lot of confusion of the two companies. And we actually looked at acquiring eMerck because we would get our name back. It didn't quite pan out. We didn't particularly like their pipeline. But it's another issue that you and what you're doing, the types of classes you're teaching, always have to think about, which is something called corporate culture. And the corporate culture for eMerck and for some of the other companies we looked at, like Upjohn, didn't quite mesh with what we were doing. We just couldn't see an advantage to it. The pipeline sometimes was duplicative, which creates problems in the United States for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Trade Commission over too much concentration. And they actually have formulas for how much concentration you can have in an area. So I did that for 3 years, and then I wanted some international experience, but I wasn't quite ready to move overseas. So I moved back to West Point, Pennsylvania, and was assigned to one of our vice presidents who was developing 2 overseas joint venture labs. One in Rome, about 30 kilometers south of Rome on the Via Pontina, which is the road down to Naples, and another one in Japan, because we had a company that we were working with there called Banyu Pharmaceuticals, and we had a 50-50 split with having acquired the company, because Japan was a very large pharmaceutical market. They use drugs extensively because the doctors sell the drugs to the patients. So they make a lot of money off of it. And at the time, they maybe made 50% of their income from selling drugs. So I spent a lot of time for a couple of years going back and forth between the United States and Tokyo, helping to do the business case, and then back to the United States, and then over to Rome to work with our joint venture partner we built right next to them. And at the time in the 80s, Italy was a very, very important pharmaceutical market. It was probably the most advanced market in the United States. Not as much regulations as in some other countries. The EMA had not quite gotten as widespread as they had, in subsequent years. So we set up a rather large laboratory, but it was an interesting idea because we didn't know what we were going to do there. So what we created was a fairly flexible laboratory that would allow us to work in a variety of different areas, because we hadn't even hired the head of the laboratory yet, who we ultimately got from University of Naples. But it was an interesting learning experience because I stayed responsible for oversight financially for the labs in Rome, south of Rome, and the facilities in Japan. And I ended up going to Japan maybe 3, 4, 5 times a year. So I spent about maybe 60 flights back and forth to Tokyo. And you start seeing how science is done differently in different parts of the world. And I picked up responsibility in Japan for being liaison for clinical trials, getting the forms over, making sure we could get recruiting appropriately at the right level, and then talking with Japanese physicians and what we would call in this country KOLs, key opinion leaders, over which drugs made sense in their market. And then I started picking up responsibility for other overseas labs. We had a laboratory in Montreal, in Dorval, not too far from the airport. And then we had a very large neuroscience facility about maybe 50, 60 kilometers north of London, halfway between Oxford and Cambridge in Hertfordshire, an area called Turlings Park. And that was just focused on neuroscience. So I ran around the world for a number of years. And then I used to help start these labs up and do the business cases. And then somebody decided, well, geez, if you know how to start a lab, you probably know how to close a lab, because we were starting to downsize a little bit and finding there were some assets that didn't quite fit into our strategic plan. So we had a facility in Kansas that was on the campus of Kansas State University. It was really focused on just drug delivery. And it was a technology that didn't seem to be quite meshing with some of our products. It was a swallowable osmotic pump. And so I got sent out to help close the laboratory, which it takes a long time to close something. You have all these financial entanglements, vendors in the city that you're taking care of, equipment that needs to be either brought back or sold or auctioned or donated to the local university. And that took quite a while. And then our president of the research labs was always interested in starting a new laboratory near a university in a very specific area, neuroscience, because he felt we needed more exposure, not just in the UK, but locally. So I did the business cases for building a laboratory in West Point, Pennsylvania, which is where I would say where my mail was delivered when I wasn't at the airport, or in Rahway, New Jersey, which is where corporate headquarters was for decades before they moved to White House Station, Reddington Township.
Well, just a question. When
Sure.
you talk about cases, what do you put in a case? How do you define a case study?
Well, for doing it for the company, what you look at is, who's around you. You look at the strategic alliances that you might be able to form in the what now we're calling in this country the ecosystem.
Mhm.
Who's around you? You know, do you build in a major city? And if you do, what are the impediments? So if we decide we're going to build a new facility, whether it's CERN building a new laboratory in Paris, on the outskirts of Paris, who's around you? Because you want to be able to find students, you want to be able to find people to collaborate with. And a lesson that we learned with this large project I did before I retired was every recruit is a spousal recruit. So if I hire somebody as a neuroscientist to work in this laboratory on the outskirts of Paris, what about their spouse? Is there an opportunity for them in this facility, or are there other companies or universities around you? So that's the disadvantage. So at Merck one time we had a research laboratory out in Chibray. I think it was out in Clermont-Ferrand, and the only thing nearby was a medical school. And at one point they had promised a high-speed rail link, which never actually happened. So it was a very small airport, and we had trouble recruiting scientists.
Mhm.
We had trouble retaining even technicians in the laboratory because it was just so isolated. And ultimately, about 8 or 9 years ago, we actually closed the facility down. It was just too hard. It was too far out in this, not even in the suburbs of a major city. It was just too far away from
Mhm.
people where you could recruit from, who you could then offer the ability to have interactions with universities. Because we look at universities in the pharma industry as windows on new technologies. You know, the universities are there to, hate to say, they're there to discover the truth. And then industry is very good at applied science and taking some of those basic observations and figuring out how is it really going to work? Is there something that we can come up with a drug in 10, 12 years? And I think in this current age of COVID, what has made it a little bit more difficult is the public perception of how these vaccines were developed, so rapidly with this, whether you like it or not, this warp speed project. And I remind people who are hesitant to take the vaccines in the United States and even overseas that nobody developed this messenger RNA vaccine in 1 year. The
Mhm.
scientists working on this have been working for 10 or 12 years.
Mhm.
There is a company here locally, and their labs are actually in California called Inovio.
Mhm. Yes, I
And
know that. I know
yeah,
this.
they've been working on a DNA vaccine.
Mhm.
They tried one for Zika virus. It didn't quite work out well. They worked on one for Ebola. That didn't quite work out. Part of it is it's not just a vaccine, but how you get the vaccine into your arm. They have to use electroporation.
Mhm.
And World Health and Johns Hopkins said that's a barrier to entry to this being used extensively. Is now you have two devices. You not only do you have to have a vial and a syringe, but now you got to have this little device that's going to be stuck on your arm and open the cells. So they are working on a vaccine, and their president, who actually was an engineer at Merck before he went off to get his MBA and PhD, made some rather stupid statements. He said, I got the sequence, and in 1 week I had a vaccine. Didn't have a vaccine. But the thing is that that's out in the press. It
Mhm.
pumped his stock, and companies like that get sued for artificial inflation, putting out information. What they didn't say is that they have been collaborating with the scientists at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, and this guy's been working on DNA vaccines for 26 years.
Mhm.
When I was at Merck in the 80s, I worked on our chickenpox vaccine,
Mhm.
which was an inactivated vaccine. That took us 23 years to get into the market.
Mhm.
It took 26 years to get the rotavirus vaccine that was developed with work from Wistar and Children's Hospital in Philadelphia for Merck to deploy that and really refine the process and get a stable vaccine out. 26 years, that's a generation. That's the problem is when they see this rapid rollout, that's leading to distrust of people looking at the vaccines as an experimental substance, and that's why they're not going to get it. So yes, we're approaching 50, maybe 60%, but that's the adult population. You have people who are hesitant to give it to children, above the age of 12.
Mhm.
And we have these huge pockets in the Midwest of people who just not only did they not wear a mask, but they're never going to put a vaccine in their arm.
Mhm.
And that's going to mean we'll probably never achieve herd immunity in
Mhm.
the States. And look at the problems that you've been through in France and the problems with Italy. The lockdown. I have a good friend who lives in Australia, and she's in Victoria and Port Melbourne. They're in lockdown again.
Yeah.
They're
Yes.
just having a real difficult time of controlling the spread because of a lack of cooperation on the part of the public. And it's made worse by what the World Health Organization calls an infodemic.
Mhm.
People post on these online blogs that 99.5% of people recover. This is no worse than the flu. Why
Yes.
am I going to inject this experimental stuff into my arm?
Mhm.
So it's interesting to see how this is all being perceived. So we're trying these case studies for our graduate seminar. Um, one of them last week I did a lecture on conflict of interest. And the vaccines are highlighting these conflicts of interest. And there's been so much disinformation about Anthony Fauci that he and Bill Gates started Moderna, that he and Bill Gates were roommates together at Columbia. Well, first, Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard, and Tony Fauci didn't go to Columbia. He went to Columbia Medical School, and Tony Fauci is 15 years older than Bill Gates. There's absolutely no way they could have been roommates. But that gets out there, and then again, that leads to distrust. So one of the case studies that we had last week was a professor, and there are always gaps in these case studies, which is how Harvard does it. So that you have to sort of fill in the gaps, and then we tell the students at the beginning of the exercise, there is no right answer and there's no wrong answer because it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in these case studies. So one of the ones we used last week was a professor who is a physician at a medical school, and she has stock in 3 biotechnology companies that are doing quite well. And she is approached by one of these biotech companies because she's a cardiologist. She has a very good practice in this hospital, and they have a new compound to treat the consequences of a myocardial infarction. And they want her to be part of the clinical trials. They're going to pay her $5,000 per patient to incentivize her to enroll patients, which is not quite legal, but they want her to enroll the patients. And so it brings up conflict of interest. She owns stock in the company that's asking her to work for them. So there's conflict number one. Secondly, she's worried because she's seen the animal data and she knows that in some of these patients that they may go into a stage of having some kidney problems. So right there, if she starts detecting that, she's going to know that those patients are on the drug. And she's going to treat them differently than the people who are on placebo. And then she also notices, based on the animal data, that some of her patients are flushing. So again, here's a tell that says they were probably getting the drug because it's potentially a vasodilator, which is going to store blood flow in the damaged heart muscle. So here's another conflict of interest. So, these are the things that the students have to address. So when you talk about conflict of interest, there are things you can do. You can mitigate it. You can divest if you own stock in the companies. You can distance yourself. So she could ask one of her clinical fellows to enroll the patients, and she simply sees the data at a very high level. So these are the things that we talk about. Now, would it make a difference if she didn't own the stock? That would be a big thing. But what if they offered her stock if she completes the trial? That's also a conflict of interest because she's going to want to give them the results that they want to see. So the second case study was a similar type of situation of conflict of interest. It was a professor who is approached by a dermatology company, and they have a substance that the FDA, because it's by prescription, has said, we're not quite sure what the consequences are of one of your components. And this dermatologist, an MD, has a particular type of assay that company's interested in. So they give him $250,000 to do a study with the promise that if he gives them the kind of results they want, that there will be more work in the future. So, here's a conflict of interest of, my science versus if I do it right and give them the answer they want, I'll get more work.
Okay, and how your students react to the COVID vaccine? Do they accept it? Are they open?
They're open to it. What's interesting is this semester, all of my students are in the United States, but the program that I teach in has a very large contingent of Indian students. So my class is at night from 8 o'clock to 9:30, which, it's 10 and a half hours right now to India. So, let's it be in the morning, early morning over there for the students. So, if you're in India, I'm going to say you're in panic mode right now. They have barely vaccinated something like 3 or 4% of the population. So, the United States sending over 8 million doses of vaccine is a drop in the bucket. It's not going to help anything over there. And they have not rolled it out well. Japan is in the same position. Japan is only vaccinated about 4%.
It's very strange. I think, Japanese are really, this is a modern country. I do not understand why.
It is, but you know what? One of the things that they did was how they set the criteria, because it's a very aging population.
Yes. Yeah.
And they set the criteria. The first people to be vaccinated were 90 years of age and up. And they have a very large number of those people. Now, these people don't get around well. So how do you get somebody who's 90 years old to go to a vaccination center? Do you bring it to them, which is what now they're trying in the States? Or do you have the idea of getting them to a vaccine center? So, there's somebody who was 85 years old and said, I'm really at risk. And I work in the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, one of these little corner shops where you pick up, takeaway food, as the Brits call it. And they haven't even gotten down into the age of the people who are probably most at risk by being on the subway system and traveling to work. And now you've got all these people pushing back over. They really don't want the Olympics to go forward. They've eliminated all spectators. And yet on yesterday, the first softball teams are showing up in Tokyo for the start of the Olympic training, and they're really worried. They're saying it's going to cost 10 or 12 billion dollars if they cancel the Olympics. But somebody came back and said it could cost 15 to 20 billion dollars if they have an incredible outbreak in Tokyo or in Osaka or any of the major cities or these people where they have the satellite campuses going on. So, it's the sort of thing that you saw in Italy at the beginning of the first or second wave, is you have an increasingly aging population. Medical system in Japan is not that thrilling. It's a very fragmented system. There are probably 400 to 500 hospitals in Tokyo. You have 4 beds, you got a hospital. And sometimes the physician would have a small practice over a pharmacy. And after the government started getting upset over physicians selling drugs and over prescribing drugs, they'd say, okay, write a script and send it to this pharmacy. Well, what they would do is the physician would have his or her spouse go to pharmacy school and open a pharmacy right in their practice. So they kept the expense within the family. So, it's been very difficult to think about rolling out healthcare in that environment. So when I was at Merck and we were developing a drug for benign prostatic hypertrophy, BPH in men, enlargement of the prostate gland. And one of the measurements to be in the study was we had to measure the size of the prostate to see if you're really eligible. If it wasn't enlarged enough to be able to say, okay, we're shrinking it, eliminating the problem. And it can be done non-invasively with an ultrasound device where you image it with ultrasound, just like you image the heart. And most ultrasonography training is done by women. So we bought all these machines, we had them distributed around hospitals where we wanted to do the work, and we brought in a bunch of nurses who have been trained in ultrasonography. And the big barrier there was male physicians saying, I'm not going to be trained by a woman. It's out of the question. We had to go back and train a bunch of male nurses, of which there aren't an awful lot in Japan, far fewer than they are in the United States. And I don't know about French medical practice, but that was a barrier to entry to be able to do the work simply because of the gender issues of who's doing the training. And for decades and decades, there's no such thing as second opinion in Japan. If a doctor says you have cancer, you have cancer. You don't go and challenge that. In fact, the last emperor who died of stomach cancer never actually knew he had cancer because the physician felt it was just not a nice thing to tell him that he had cancer. It was just it was.
So I feel it's mostly cultural. The problem.
Oh, most assuredly, it's cultural. I'll give you an example. One of the things we did at Jefferson when I was associate dean, so I stayed at Merck for 29 years. And then my last assignment was I got moved to Boston to build a very large laboratory, 18 stories, 12 above ground, 6 below ground, 2 blocks from Harvard Medical School as a completely integrated R&D center. So we had a vivarium, so we could use animals on 2 floors. We had 4 floors of chemistry, drug metabolism, basic biology within maybe the most 100 meters of Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, as I said, 2 blocks away from, and it put us in that ecosystem of being near people doing cutting edge science and medicine across the Charles River from MIT. So just a place you want to be. So after I was there for 5 years, I decided to move back. I spent a couple years at West Point, and I had still been teaching at Jefferson. And I was in what we in the States call a professional science master's program that we had started 20 years before. And what people realized was that, yes, lots of people were getting masters in the United States and in France and UK, and they knew a lot of good science. But then they went to work for companies, small companies. And the one thing they knew was they knew how to do science, but they didn't know anything about business. So this whole concept of the professional science masters was started about 25 years ago by the Sloan Foundation with New York University, NYU. And what it involved was you took your science classes, but you also had to take courses in finance, scientific writing, biosafety. How do you design a clinical trial? Statistics. I taught for 20 years a course in this program in drug discovery issues. What are the state issues? What are the federal regulations? What about intellectual property, patents? Just because of a patent in the United States doesn't mean I have a patent in France to pursue my invention. So I went down there as associate dean for the program. And one of the things I brought in was what's called a capstone. So instead of somebody doing what we would call a wet lab thesis at the bench doing basic research, we also had one that we would look at policy. And one of my first students was first generation Vietnamese. And she wanted to go to medical school. And in the United States, in medical school, and I know it's different in other foreign countries, the medical school admission boards like to see that you've been exposed to science and you've been exposed to medicine. They want you to have some, you can't say hands-on experience, but they want you to be exposed to what it's like to work in some of these areas. They want what they call shadowing experiences.
Mhm.
And so she was shadowing in what's called a NICU, neonatal intensive care unit.
Mhm.
And she had been working there, and things that bothered her was because Philadelphia is a very multi-ethnic, just like, I've been in Paris a number of times. So you see lots of different ethnicities there. And the same thing here in Philadelphia. We have a very large Indian population, a lot of people from Southeast Asia, from the islands, and a very large population of Chinese, native-born Chinese who have moved here, just as Boston has many, and people from the Caribbean. And what she was bothered by, as were the nurses, was we know in the States, and you probably know in France, if somebody is dying and there's nothing more you can do for them, you can put them in what's called hospice care.
Mhm.
Comfort and deal with their pain until they pass. We know what to do with the teenagers. We know what to do with somebody in their 40s and somebody in their 80s. We don't know what to do with an infant.
Mhm.
A child is born and maybe they only have 3 or 4 weeks to live. So how do you deal with the parents?
Mhm.
How does the physician know what to do, especially if, as you said, death and dying has very different connotations depending upon the ethnicity. So what we worked up is we had a thesis committee. It was me as the dean and 2 nurses from the NICU. And what we developed, we mocked up, was a web page portal for
Mhm.
parents, how to find resources to help them deal with death and dying in a 2 or 3 week old infant. And we also had it as a portal for physicians. How do they approach a 4-week-old baby
Mhm.
dying and there's nothing they can do for them? And what we found was that it really is, not only is it based on ethnicity, it could be very much based on geography.
Sure.
If
Yeah.
you have a Hmong population
Mhm.
and you're
Mhm.
in Boise, Idaho, and this is the first time you've seen somebody from that ethnicity,
Mhm.
or we actually had a patient who was in, and the parents were both Indian, from India, and very traditional.
Mhm.
And the father came and told the nurses one morning after they had been talking to his wife, and he dragged them out into the hall and said, "I'm sorry, you have any news to tell me about my child, you do not talk to my wife. I am the man of the house. You tell me and I will decide what I tell her."
Mhm.
So that's the kind of capstone that we did with one of the students. And I have a student right now who happens to be a patent lawyer,
Mhm.
and we're finishing up his master's, and we're looking at patentability of new inventions. As patenting has gotten tighter in the United States, as it's gotten tighter in the EU, but China has been opening their patents. What is that going to do for the start of new business? If you have something that is not patentable under our new guidelines, but you can patent it overseas, perhaps in
Mhm.
Thailand or in China, is that going to prevent a flow of capital to
Mhm.
some of these new countries if they look at it and say, you really don't have good freedom to operate with this new invention?
Mhm.
And is it going to discourage people if they figure out, I can't patent life as the change and what's going on with the patent laws? And the big thing was, back in the late 90s, that the Uruguay round of the GATT treaty, where you went from, it used to be whoever was first to invent got a patent. The rest of the world was first to file. Well, then the United States reconciled. Now it's first to file, not first to invent. And now patents are 20 years. They used to be much shorter in the United States. But people in our wonderful Congress don't realize that of that 20-year patent, on average, you only have about 7 to 8 years of patent life, because the patent is when this drug is still in development. And
Mhm.
until it's marketed, you can't talk about it. And so, you spent $2.1 billion and all you've got is maybe 7 years of patent protection before it goes generic. And then,
Just a second, Dennis. I'll
sure.
turn on the light. I'll turn because it's getting dark here. And
Okay,
then
you have to turn
I
the
have
room
2
light on.
questions for you. Just a second.
Sure.
Much better. There's a little light.
Put my glasses on so I can actually see what I'm saying. Hang on one second.
Okay.
There we go.
So
I'm blind. I need my glasses to see my glasses.
yeah, I have 2 questions for you
Sure.
because I want to close this first discussion, and if you give me another time so we can continue this discussion
Sure,
another
no problem.
time. Okay. So according to what I understood from your experience and from what you explained, can we say that the collaboration that happened between BioNTech and Pfizer, it's something to do with their culture of innovation, their culture of technology, their background? Can we put them together? And
You know,
why do they collaborate together? You know, because as you said, German pharmaceuticals is not the same as U.S. pharmaceutical culture.
no,
But
in
I
one,
have heard that Pfizer had also German roots. You know, the people who they just the first owners of Pfizer, they came from Germany. So maybe.
I don't think that plays into anything anymore. You know, these companies are so far from their founding. I mean, you know, Merck had a German basis too, and I think people look at who founded these companies as that's nice history. It's nice to look at. It's nice to put in these volumes where we started from in Darmstadt, Germany. But I don't think it means anything to anybody. What you are seeing, and it's a very real issue these days, is moving from pharma 3.0 to what people are not talking about, pharma 4.0, and realizing that, and this was even when I was in you know, in industry. I retired from Merck in 2006, and we went to the university, and then I retired from the university full time about 6 years ago. Is that we finally decided that we can't discover it all. Where you are is very, very important, which is why companies had built laboratories near certain places, but they also realized you needed these strategic alliances. And it's brought about this whole issue of um, CROs, contract research organizations, which originally were started to help large companies do follow up, do recruiting. You've got to find 10,000 children for a follow up study for a vaccine, and you got to follow them for 10 years. How do you find those patients? So CROs originally got started just for clinical purposes. Now CROs are, they will do everything for you. They will do your safety studies. They will help write your IND. They will write your NDA. They will help you deal with the EMA documentation that has to be filed. They will help you with your reports through your the rapporteur and the co-rapporteur, help interpreting them. The issue became over the past couple of years is big pharma got a little bit too big and a little bit too unwieldy, and they started spinning off smaller companies. The smaller companies realized they didn't have all the assets to do this. So I'll give you a good example. Merck bought a company in New York called Aton Pharma. They had a very interesting cancer compound, which was a spinoff. Their company was a spinoff from Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a world-class cancer center. It's like Fox Chase and some of the other cancer centers. President and vice president were both MDs from Memorial Sloan Kettering. They had a very small operation in Tarrytown, New York, with, I think it was 4 chemists, 3 biologists, and 1 physician. That's it. Everything else was outsourced. When they needed to make a little bit more of their compound, they outsourced it to a company who did what we call scale up. When they needed to think about doing safety assessment, they outsourced it to a company who could do safety assessment under good laboratory practices. When they were getting ready to decide to do phase 1 clinical trials, they outsourced putting it in the capsules. They outsourced writing the IND. So this created this entire concept, and I don't know how pervasive it is in France. I know it is working in Germany to some degree. I don't think it's even hit the bricks yet in Italy. UK has started doing some of this, is creating a virtual pharmaceutical company. And some companies like GSK actually experimented with it, and it worked. They actually internally created a virtual pharmaceutical company within the company, just as a test bed to see could they develop a product faster. And they did. They got into the clinic with some oncology products far faster by saying, okay, we'll do some of the chemistry, we'll do some of the initial biology to do proof of concept, and then we're going to outsource the extensive work. And we're going to outsource some of the other activities. So that's where things are going these days. And part of that is developing these strategic alliances. So that's what Pfizer looked at was they've been making vaccines because Pfizer merged with Wyeth. And Wyeth's big claim to fame was they had lots of vaccines. And they had Prevnar, which was a vaccine for pneumonia. And so they realized they needed to get into this. And they worked with these 2 Turkish scientists who were in Germany because that let them develop a strategic alliance. The downside is that now they've announced, well, they've learned everything they need to learn from this group in Germany, and now they're going to use that technology to develop their own vaccines using messenger RNA for not necessarily for infectious diseases, but potentially for targeted, what we would call tumor agnostic cancers.
Is it legal? Is it legal to use the same technology for their own vaccines?
You know, the patents are patents. You know, patent says, I'm going to sue you if you use my technology. So using messenger RNA, what you've got is a use patent for a very specific target. So, you know, Merck is going through that right now with Keytruda, and I'm sure you see the ads in France for it. It was originally developed as a vaccine or as a monoclonal against non-resectable melanoma. They just have been working with other companies, combining their drugs. They have one for non-resectable melanoma. They have one for lung cancer. Each of those is a use patent. The basic compound has a product patent on it, and then for every use you have another patent. So I'm sure that Pfizer and the German company have a use patent for messenger RNA technology with a lipid nanoparticle for COVID-19. If it goes into some other infectious disease, you have to file another use patent. So it's not that it's illegal, it's just a spin-off. So Pfizer's looking at the technology as a platform. And how you make it is what's called a process patent. There's easy to get around process patents. Maybe BioNancy has developed a process for those lipid nanoparticles, but that's been an area that people have been working on for a long time. You've got Moderna that obviously has their game in the plan, and they're looking at other targets. They've been looking at other targets before the COVID-19 came up, and this gave it an opportunity to get some money. Pfizer accepted no money from the U.S. government for the development of this project. They helped with the distribution, the logistics, but the R&D aspects of it was all internally funded, which people in this country forget about. Moderna took money. AstraZeneca took some money working with Oxford. That's been a disaster. Truly, some of the press over here said, did anybody really think AstraZeneca could develop a vaccine? They said, get real. So, they made a mistake. They dosed the first batch of patients with half the concentration and got really good results. Then went back and said, oh, now we need to repeat the studies with full doses for both dose 1 and dose 2. They did full doses for 1 and 2, and the effect was less than if they did half dose and then a full dose. It's really a problem, and I'm sure it is in France too, is what do we do about immunocompromised patients? What do you do about transplant patients? They're finding over here that after 2 doses, the best of these patients are maybe only have 40 or 50% protection. Now they're thinking there are 2 studies going on in the States now giving a 3rd dose to transplant patients to see if they can, it's not quite a booster, but it seems to be priming their immune system. But it's brought up all these issues of, as all these vaccines were being developed, people were shopping. Most people get the flu vaccine. You probably get the flu vaccine, and you know what happens. You get
my doctor told me, advised me always, you do not need the flu vaccine. It's for old people.
A lot of we have 20 to 30,000 deaths every year from influenza in the United States, and this year's been very low, but because everyone's walking around with a mask. And we've been all sitting at home, so we're not out exposing ourselves in shopping malls and supermarkets. But the issue became that when people said this is only the flu, and they know how they respond to the flu vaccine or any of the other vaccines that you might get, Hep A, Hep B, you run a low-grade fever and your arm is sore. So people in the initial clinical phase 2 trials were getting what they thought were vaccine. They were not getting a low-grade fever. They were not getting a sore arm. They didn't get the expanse. They figured, oh, crap. I didn't get the vaccine. So they drop out of the clinical trials and go and get into another clinical trial.
Oh, yeah.
To find out. So that made it really difficult. So it created a whole new area of statistics for the companies and for the FDA to evaluate the data. How do you deal with missing data? You have somebody that got the first shot and didn't get the second shot.
Yes. Yeah.
So, that's part of how, I think Pfizer wants to file their ND or their BLA, and I believe Moderna is not far behind them and trying to file their BLA to get full approval, not just emergency use. So it creates all these problems of, how do you bring it forward? And then with, 3rd waves, 4th waves, the problems they've had in Spain and countries opening up. This country, the pushback over vaccine passports is just, you think you were taking away your birth certificate. Give me a break. The governor of Florida has said he's going to fine any company $5,000 per instance if they require that you prove you've been vaccinated. This is really a problem for the cruise line industry because there are 3 ports that are used in Florida. And one of the big cruise ships has said, a celebrity, that we want everybody that is on board, including our crew, you have to prove a vaccination before we're going to let you travel with us. So they're trying to figure out, if you got a ship with 3,000 people on it, they're going to pay a fine of $5,000 per person. To prove that they're vaccinated. And people here, I can go online, I can buy a fake vaccine card and ship it to you. And that's the problem, is anybody can fill it out.
I know. It's an emerging problem, the fake authorization and certificate of vaccination and PCR test. It's becoming, even in Europe, it's becoming a real problem. But my concern is about yes. Do you think that something has changed in the future of the strategic collaboration between companies on technology platforms, on using technology platforms, or for future, because I have read a lot that this mRNA vaccine has changed the future forever. So there will be new models of strategic alliances between companies. There will be more international collaboration. I think that's a very positive result.
It is. I think you're right. There will be more collaborations. We're seeing it already here with joint sales forces. A lot of, we have these things called DTC ads, direct to consumer. And I think there's only 3 other countries in the world that allow it, New Zealand and 2 other small island nations. You don't allow them in the EU. But here we see companies that are joining their sales forces to sell a product. And where this actually really happened, surprisingly enough, was COVID is nice and it has forced these collaborations. But back when the AIDS drugs were being developed, what many companies realized is there were only so many ways of getting people into a clinical trial. And the government came forward and said, you guys have got to collaborate. You're all writing slightly different protocols. You're all going after the same patient. So a lot of companies started collaborating on the clinical trials and on recruiting and finding the right kind of patients. Because exactly what I was just talking about for the vaccines was happening for the AIDS drugs. This was a very educated patient population. And the initial drugs were intravenous, protein-like things, 3TC from Bristol Myers Squibb, from Bristol, and was really a smart population because these things were peptide-based. And what got written up in the newspapers, we're talking about professional journals, was that patients would try to figure out, am I on placebo or am I actually getting a drug for my HIV/AIDS? So they'd go to the pharmacy in the United States and they'd get these little dipsticks that diabetics use to check how much protein is coming out in my urine. And so they take this drug that was in a bag of saline in the refrigerators, and they take a syringe, they take some of it, and they put it on the dipstick. And if it turned positive, they knew they were getting the drug. If it didn't, they knew they were on placebo, and they would drop out of the trial, and they'd go and find another company's drug. Or the worst part was, they'd get a friend, maybe their roommate. They'd say, okay, I'm going to take the Bristol drug on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You take yours on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and then next week we'll switch, and we'll see who gets better faster. So talk about confounding things. So I don't think everybody learned their lesson on how this came forward. Now we've got COVID, and still there's a limited patient population. In fact, the government, I think, has backed away from Inovio and said, you know what, we have enough COVID vaccines right now. We really don't need your DNA vaccine because the barrier to entry is how you deliver it. We've got an excess. We've got hundreds of millions of drugs sitting around. We're shipping 80 million drugs overseas through COVAX. We don't need you. So what worries me is you've got a lot of these alliances that have been set up. There are still, I think, 12 to 15 other companies still trying to develop COVID-19 vaccines. I was just looking at the Wall Street Journal today. Maybe it was Brazil or one other country is really having problems with the Chinese vaccine. It really doesn't appear to be working. So now they're going to go back and give the Pfizer vaccine to everybody it was one of these Middle Eastern countries. Maybe it was Abu Dhabi, said, you got this Chinese vaccine. Come back and we're going to give you a 3rd dose of a Pfizer vaccine, because guess what? The Chinese vaccine isn't working. People are even complaining that if you hold 2 vials up from different shipments, the color of the solution was different. One was clear, the other one was a little bit darker. Same thing with the Russian vaccine, which got, it's created this whole area. And I think it's something you ought to take a look at as a potential story of vaccine diplomacy. The Russians rushed theirs out worldwide. The Chinese did the same thing, pushing them into countries like India that can't make their own. And that brings up this whole issue of the World Health Organization calling for all these patents to be invalidated so everybody can make them. I don't think they realize we're not making Tylenol, acetaminophen, which is a 1-step chemical process. I'm involved in making a vaccine facility at Merck, which in most companies in the world, vaccines for clinical trials are made by the research division. Until the technology gets stable and gets moved over to manufacturing, the R&D division makes them. And we have a big facility at West Point, Pennsylvania. It costs $3,000 per square foot to make this facility, and it runs 24/7. You never not run it. The air conditioning is always running. The filtration systems are always running, because if it goes out of compliance, it could take you 3 or 4 months to bring it back in compliance to reduce the bioburden. So the idea of Sri Lanka or the Ivory Coast deciding we're going to start making a vaccine when you don't have either the expertise, you don't have the equipment, which at this stage could take 2 years to get, build a factory, and you're going to start rolling out a copy of the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine. and damage the reputation of those three firms by making, I hate to use the old line we used to use, excuse my French, making crap is going to cause a disillusionment with that modality for preventing the disease for the next pandemic that comes out there. And we don't learn lessons. You know, people going back and say, okay, take a look what happened after the Spanish flu outbreak of 1917 through 1919. The roaring 20s in the United States and Europe were a response to the Spanish flu epidemic. And people are worried that's going to happen now. So Memorial Day, what did we have in the United States? 138,000 people showed up at the Indianapolis 500, maskless. So people are saying, was that a super spreader event? Now we got to watch, wait and see what happens 2 weeks after that. How many people were vaccinated? The worry here is, were you vaccinated? Sure, I was vaccinated. You know, you're not going to be asked to carry that card because nobody wants to carry the card. If they have it, you know, it's an invasion of my privacy, just like folks were saying wearing a mask is an invasion. So you're right. The dynamic is very different. A lot of companies have realized they don't have all the answers. The barrier is finding people at universities willing to collaborate. You know, there's always been this schism between academic, or as we call it in the United States, the academy and business.
Maybe in US, I do not know. I personally, I do not.
Oh, you're right. You are 100% right, because, you know, I was part of a team. We worked with Astra when Astra was, you know, a Swedish company before they merged with what was ICI, that became Zeneca, and that's AstraZeneca. And one of the faculty I worked with, and when we were licensing in products from Astra, the guy worked 5 days a week at Astra, 4 days a week, and then 2 days a week he was at a university in Sweden. And he went back and forth all the time. Franz Gross, same thing in Germany. 2 years he worked at a German pharmaceutical company. Then he went to industry. Then he went to academics. Then he went back, and sometimes he held joint positions. Nobody in Europe looks down at somebody who had been at a university and then went to work. It's not like you sold your soul, which is the way it's looked at in the United States, and then you went back, as I've done. You know, first I went from academics at a medical school to industry, and then I went to academics, and now I'm back dealing with the industry. I'm one of the few who've done that, because people look at that as, you know, and I just had this discussion once in a cab with one of my bosses in Tokyo, is that people look at what is done at universities in the United States as you're there to discover the truth. And what you're doing is beautiful science. And as soon as you go to industry, you're there for money, and you're there because it's the dark arts. You know, you've gone to the dark side because somebody's going to make money off of your science. Well, guess what, folks?
What about yourself? What's your experience? Do you really believe that this is dark art, what they do?
No. I mean, I'm a PhD. I found 2 drugs for treating high blood pressure and treating congestive heart failure in animals. My drug, the second one I discovered, was called lisinopril. It is the most heavily prescribed generic in the world. Hundreds of millions of people have taken that. As a PhD, I can't practice medicine. I'm an amateur astronomer, but I can't be an amateur neurologist. So here's my contribution to the world: is I've discovered a drug that is used by hundreds of millions of people. And when I go and give talks on, you know, in this country we have this thing called TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. Well, in industry back when I was there, you know, 80s, 90s, what we used to call the golden age, it used to be TGIM. Thank God it's Monday. You enjoyed going back to the laboratory. You enjoyed working, not just with your laboratory team, you enjoyed solving problems, which is why I stayed in pharma for 29 years, is solving the problems, dealing with doing science in a business-like manner, and running science like a business. And I don't think that people in academics truly appreciate that, because I'm the co-chair for this national entrepreneur boot camp that's run every year at the bio meeting. This year, we're going to do it in the fall as a hybrid. We're going to try it out. And every year we bring in people from academics. We have about 130 people, a lot of people coming now from the Far East and from Eastern Europe, understanding how to start a company. What are the issues, the IP issues, dealing with the press. And we always talk about, you know, as a startup, people coming from academics are the worst business people in the world. They fall in love with their discoveries, and they always think they're worth more than they are. So we always tell them, you know, you may be the president or CEO of your company, or both, and you form a board of directors. And they should be very hesitant about forming a board of directors. First, it's got to be an odd number, so there are never any ties. And when you form your board of scientific advisors, just don't try and find Nobel laureates and people who are members of the French Academy, because everybody's going to see through that in a heartbeat, as we say, that they're there for their name. You want people who are invested and dedicated to the company, not just there because you're paying them to show up at a board meeting 4 times a year. And be prepared for, as the company matures, your board of directors may decide, you know what, you were fine to start the company, and get it to the stage where you've got your first round of, say, angel funding or venture capital. But you know what? You're not the person to take it to the next level. And thanks for all your help. You're now on the board of scientific advisors. We're going to bring in somebody who knows something about business. And that's why so many of these small companies fail, is they don't truly appreciate that. And that's why university professors make the worst people as heads. And the problem becomes that too many universities in the United States do not have business schools nearby. So the example that I used for our student development at Jefferson was about, I'd say 8 or 9 years ago now. Another friend of mine who was at Wyeth before the merger, we formed a club that we called the Biz Bio, Business Aspects of Biology. And it was for graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and medical students. And we had a board of directors. The president of the board of directors was a woman. She was a PhD student in pharmacology, I believe. And we had a board of about 6 people, 1 medical student and the postdocs and the pre-docs, as we call them. There wasn't one member of the board of directors. The physician did not want to practice medicine when he graduated. He was getting an MD and a PhD. He wanted to become a consultant, and he works for McKinsey right now. The woman who was head of it wanted to become a medical writer, and she is. She's now vice president for medical writing for a big company in Manhattan. There wasn't one pre-doc, postdoc, or medical student who actually wanted to go into academics. They all wanted to go into consultancy. They wanted to be able to solve problems, write articles, be an author, be involved with somebody like Thomson Reuters, investigate things, IQVIA. And I find that fascinating. So over the years, we've done things like panel discussions. How do you start companies? What are the issues? How do you know if you're too early in filing your intellectual property protection? In this country would be, say, a provisional patent. Because faculty are terrible at helping to make these decisions. And the worst people are in the States. We have career counselors, guidance counselors who help people. The worst part about it is these people have never held a job in their entire life in the real world, and they're advising students, here's how you develop your career. Here's how to write a CV. Here's how to write a resume. And every year I review resumes at Drexel University in Philadelphia in their School of Chemical Engineering. So these people are bachelor's, master's, PhD students. And every year we'll have a meeting with 20 students, and we give them pizza and sodas, and we look at their resumes. And so every year we start out with a very small number of us from industry. And the first thing I always ask my group of students is, how many of you brought a business card? And I can tell you for the past 8 years, there isn't one student in that room who raises his or her hand at brought a business card. And I said, you know what? I'm tired when we get to the social part of this exercise of writing your name and your email address on a cocktail napkin. Don't ever show up again at a meeting with professionals without a business card. And I don't care if this is the 21st century. I collect business cards. I write on the back. If I was meeting you face to face, I'd write on the back anything I promised to send you. And when I go back to my office, I will go through my collection of cards in the meeting, and I'll go through my to-do list of what I promised to send you and your contact information. And I may even send out something on LinkedIn, as you did, be able to be part of that. And I said, that's what life is like in the 21st century.